Hello, chess fans. This is Roger Capello bringing you my week at the club from the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass. My weekly game this week's against Paul Godin, and I'll get right into that. But first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about astronomy, my weekly tidbit. And today, at the Haystack Christmas party, I sat next to a guy named Mike Hecht, who is the principal investigator for an experiment called MOXIE. MOXIE, kind of like the beverage, and it stands for, I have to actually read this, Mars Oxygen In Situ Resource Experiment. And what it is, it's going to be carried on the 2020 rover. That's what the picture here is over on the right. That'll be the next mission to Mars after the current one. And it's a box about a little bigger than a shoebox, under a cubic foot though in size, of electronics and plumbing that will convert the atmosphere of Mars, which is almost entirely carbon dioxide. It's like 96% carbon dioxide. We'll take that and separate the carbon dioxide into two pieces, into a stream of carbon monoxide and also molecular oxygen. And all it does, it's not actually going to use that for anything. It's a demonstrator experiment that's going to show that we can really do this on the surface of Mars under the very low Mars pressure and the temperatures on Mars and with a little bit of dust in the atmosphere and so on. And you might ask, why would you want to separate the Martian atmosphere into its component pieces? The answer is that for future sample return missions from the surface of Mars, NASA would like to actually produce rocket fuel on the surface of Mars so they don't have to carry it all down. It really simplifies the task of getting a lander to the surface and then back and have enough energy to get back to the Earth. And if you had, say, a hydrogen and oxygen rocket, so liquid hydrogen and oxygen, that was your fuel and the oxidizer. It turns out that the oxygen is about 90% of the mass that is involved in that chemical reaction. And so if you can synthesize the oxygen locally on Mars and put it into a tank, then and fill your rocket up with that, then you're really ahead of the game. So that's what MOXIE is about, and they're just, as I said before, they're really trying to show that it's possible to do this without hitting any snags. It was just interesting talking to them about that. So on to my game. I played Paul Godin in the fourth round of the current tournament that's going on, the George Sturgis Memorial. And we both had 3 points, and so this was the first board contest to see who goes on with 4 points. And Paul was going to have white, so I actually spent a fair bit of time this week preparing for this game. As I played Paul about 3 weeks ago, and if you look at that video, you'll notice that I was not happy with the position that I got. I lost that game, and I noted, why do I keep playing the same defense against his setup? So this week I went out and did a little bit of research. I went onto the web. I found what John Bartholomew likes to play against this setup, and I went with his recommendation. And it actually turned out pretty well, as you'll see. So what Paul likes to do is to play basically a ready slash King's Indian attack kind of setup, but starting out with knight f3. And rather than fianchettoing my kingside like I did in that last game, I instead set up a kind of a solid pawn formation with d5 and c6, so that it's very strong along this diagonal that he'd like his bishop to be operating along. And so that's how he went the first few moves. I got my bishop outside of my pawn chain because pretty soon I'm going to play the pawn here to e6. He plays d6. Now I played knight f6 first before playing e6, and the reason was that I just want to exert a little more control over this e4 square to make it hard for white to actually play pawn to e4. So he would like to play pawn to e4, so possibly do that. And so he played, developed his knight to d2. And I can't really do anything more to prevent that move, so I just go ahead with my plan of making this strong pawn triangle here, this formation with, whoops, forget that arrow, with these squares. It's really a pretty solid formation and hard for white to break down. Okay, he played c4. I should say at this time that I noticed also in looking through various games of Paul's that he likes to start developing slowly. He doesn't typically mix it up right away in the center, but it seems like often he will develop his pieces slowly, and then after he has things in place to spring an attack on you. So I decided, to the extent that I could, that I would try to grab some space myself and take advantage of that. So I played c4, but I'm, as I said before, this, oops, that was not a move. This d5 square is strongly protected by my pawns, so I don't have to do anything. And instead, I choose to play h6, which is a useful little move. The main reason for this is that at some point I might find it useful to retreat my bishop back to h7, because he might play his knight out to h4, attacking my bishop. And also, it might be useful for Luft for my king after I've castled. And finally, it serves to control this g5 square so that his knight can't use that square for any purpose. So, or his bishop. His bishop on c1 is blocked right now, but in principle, at some point, it could have come out and pinned that knight, for example. So h6 is a useful move. He traded pawns off, and now rather than go for a symmetric pawn structure, I decided to get a little bit of imbalance in the position and open up, get a half-open e-file here for, oh, I seem to be making moves when I don't want to with the mouse here. Half-open e-file so that at some point I can put some pressure on his e-pawn. He castled. I played bishop to e2, and that's, well, for developing, but also realizing that his next move might be to play the rook to e1, and I wanted to be prepared to castle quickly and get off of the e-file myself, and to try to be ready to do business on e4. He didn't do that right away. Instead, he played a3, and this actually is the novelty in the game. That's where we diverge from the published databases. And there are about 8 or 9 games, something like that, maybe 10 in this previous position here. And in this position, the popular moves are pawn to b3, just getting ready to fianchetto that black bishop, dark squared bishop, e4, which, believe it or not, actually can be played in this position, even though it looks like it can't be, just because I end up with some awkwardness on the e-file with my pieces lined up by his rook. And knight to h4 to drive my bishop back to h7, and also to open up the eyes a little bit of his bishop on g2. So those are the main moves. He played a3. I decided to keep him from grabbing space on the queen side, so I played a5, which means that he'll have to do quite a bit of preparation now to try to get b4 in. In fact, play actually is kind of based on, for about the next half a dozen moves or so, on whether or not he can get in b4, and I keep trying to prevent that move, as you'll see. First, he plays rook to e1, and I castled, and then he played rook to b1. As I note in my note here, instead of playing rook to b1, go back here. If he had played his pawn to e4. This doesn't work because I can just exchange here. Pawn takes, knight takes. And then when he takes back, I trade queens and take the bishop, or take the knight rather. And actually, the line goes a bit further. This is as far as I think I looked at it in the game. But if he continues then to play rook to e1, it looks like I might be losing a piece. But of course, I can just trade off that light squared bishop. Well, first, I mean, I could trade it off for the knight, but if I do that, then it's trading a bishop for a knight. I'd rather not do that. So instead, you'd probably want to play pawn to f5, force him to commit his knight, and then trade the bishop off for his light squared bishop, and then move my dark squared bishop. And black has a little bit of a pull here. Nothing huge, but you know, he's a pawn up, and he has perhaps a few problems developmentally here. This knight to c4 could start to put pressure on his position, but it's not a whole pawn's worth. So black's is for choice, I guess you'd say. Okay, so instead of playing e4 though, back in this position, he played his rook to b1. Okay, obviously that's getting ready to play this move, pawn to b4. So I prevented that with knight to a6. And then he made a knight maneuver, which it's headed for a square that doesn't work out too well for him, as you'll see. I went ahead and developed my rook to the half-open file. And now he played his knight to e3. And I was perfectly happy with him coming here, because I figured his knight, other than the bishop that he's attacking, which I can just move back to safety. In fact, I do that. Once I do that, now where's his knight going to go? He can't, you know, this is not a safe square because my knight's attacking it. He could retreat his knight. I mean, he could do some more maneuvering. He could perhaps do something like this sort of maneuver at some point, I suppose. But on e3, it seems like it's just blocking his bishop, and even maybe more importantly, constraining this pawn that's keeping his rook from playing and his queen off of this diagonal coming under the king side. So it really congests his pieces. In fact, this is a good point to look at the board and see what I was talking about. If you look at if you were to draw a center line between my pieces and his pieces, I'll do it with an arrow, even though it's really not properly an arrow, would be on the fourth rank there. And so he's playing on the first 3 ranks, I'm playing on 4 ranks. So I actually have a space advantage here. And that's because of that, black is really has the better game, the easier game and the better game in this position. Okay, he developed his bishop. I thought at the time he was doing that to try to get the pawn to b4. And so I thought for quite a while. And if it were his move right now, then I would be happy, because I was thinking, you'll have to do this in your head, because that's an illegal move for him to move twice in a row. But I was thinking that I'll draw some arrows to help. That if he played pawn to b4, that I would take it, and he would take back, and then I would come in with my knight back to c7, and that would keep his pawn from advancing. And the next move, I would move my knight to b5, blockading that pawn. And it would be an isolated, blockaded pawn. So that was my thinking. And I sat there for quite a while trying to figure out, you know, what else useful I can do in the position, so that I keep that option open, because I thought maybe he'd be inclined to play over to b4. But I couldn't figure it out. Couldn't think of anything useful. And then I realized, well, heck, there's no reason not to just play my knight back first. The only problem with that then is that it's pretty obvious what my plan is if he plays b4, and I'm going to post up that knight, you know, in front of the pawn here on this strong b5 square. Oh, I exchange pawns first and then post up my knight in front of the Isolani. And because of that, he doesn't do it, but it's a good prophylactic move. Keeps him from playing that. So once again, I'm still working on that idea of restricting his queenside expansion. So since the queenside's not working out, he decided to do something on the king side, and this doesn't work out well. So there's nothing wrong with knight to h4, nothing great about it either. I mean, I tried to figure out some way to move my knight and get both my queen and bishop, they're lined up here on his knight, and if my knight were in the way, I could win a pawn right now. Bishop takes knight, pawn takes, queen takes. But my knight is in the way, and by the time I move it, he can take care of that. So that wasn't something I could do anything about. So instead, what I did was to improve my queen, and improve it in several ways. The principal reason for this is to get a grip on this f5 square. So now, with that last move of his out to h4, he was threatening to play a knight into h5, or f5. I don't know which knight, one or the other, but I only had my bishop controlling it, and I could have exchanged the, oops, let's go back, could have exchanged, well, if he did it, hey, stop doing that. If he does it now, he loses a piece, so that doesn't make any sense, because I have it attacked twice. Bishop takes knight, knight takes, queen takes, so I'll take that move back. But if my queen had moved up, he could have done that, and I was thinking about either to move queen c8 or queen d7. Queen c8 I liked a little better from the point of view of it not being exposed for, I was thinking that this knight will eventually come back to f3 and possibly to e5, where it would attack my queen. My queen's a little exposed there, so it'd be better on c8. On the other hand, at d7, my rooks are connected, and I wanted to have my rooks connected. So it was one of those things that I wasted a lot of time on. Okay, well, he played f4, and the reason was that, as I said, he wanted to play on the king side, and I don't know, he's going to follow up with maybe f5 or knight to f3. It's not clear. Knight to f3 and then knight into e5. But there's a problem with this move, and if you want to, you can pause your video, and if you haven't already seen it, see how black goes about basically getting a winning position here. Okay, well, it was a pretty easy one. That's just to go ahead and pin the knight. Okay, attack that puppy twice, and it's only defended once now by the bishop, and he can defend it again, which he does do with the queen, but my queen defends the bishop. That's important because there was an attack on my bishop with his queen, so that had to be defended. But even more to the point, it puts a third attack on this knight. So 3 attacks, 2 defenses. What can he do about that? The only way he can put another, well, actually, that's not true. He could put the knight here could put the knight on f5, but then my bishop would just win it, because this knight on e3 is pinned. It's not going anywhere. So that wouldn't be a good plan. He could play his king to f2, but that would be a mistake, right? Because that knight is pinned, and I can just come into g4 check. And now, whether the king comes up or goes back, now I have a 4th attack. And so that knight is history. So anyhow, there's no way to save that knight. And Paul realized that, being the strong player he is, so he just made Luft for the king, and also, incidentally, kept my knight out of coming into the g4 square, and defended his knight on h4. So a multi-purpose move. And either I take the knight now or I don't get it. So I went ahead and took it and checked him, and his king went to h2. And then I looked at this position for a while. In fact, I looked at this position for a long, long while, and I will scroll down a bit so that you can read if you don't like to hear me talk. But my original thinking was, before I went into this line, when I was just first winning the piece, was to trade off the bishops and these guys here. He takes back with the queen, and then play my queen to e3. And if he wants to trade off queens, I'd be happy to post my rook on e3. But he's under no compulsion to change queens, to exchange queens. I mean, I can force the bishop exchange, but I can't force the queen exchange. He could just retreat it to c2. And so I thought about that for a while. Then another positional idea caught my mind, which was to go ahead and play instead the pawn to d4, which is an interesting positional move because he can bring his knight back in this, but this vacated the d5 square for me. And this then allows me to have access with both my knights into this e3 square, which is, just totally dominates White's position. He does get my d pawn in the process. Oops, doesn't do that. Why, okay. Instead, oh, no, actually, no, that's right. First he would trade this off, and then when I take back with the knight, now he takes with this, yeah, when it's undefended. But, so what? My knight's posted up very strong there. It doesn't have a dark squared bishop or anything to really get it out of there. And at some point, I'll put my other knight on d5 to defend it. And my queen, since my queen and rook both defended, it's over defended. My queen is free to maneuver around. This looks very good for black. So I looked at this. This looked like a nice sequence. And I was looking at these sorts of moves. But then a sacrifice caught my eye. And not only was it a sacrifice to give my piece back, it was a sacrifice to offer him to go a piece ahead. And that seemed kind of a crazy thing to do because, I'm winning the game. Why should I go ahead like that? But I was listening to a podcast on the way over and to the chess last night. And the person I was listening to said that, well, one of the hallmarks of weaker players, I think it was Joel Benjamin, said that they hang on to the material too much. They're unwilling to give up any material. They are unwilling to sacrifice a pawn for play or whatever. So I thought about this and I said, well, I've really got to broaden my horizons here. So I looked and the problem is I couldn't perfectly analyze the resulting position. So let me go ahead and show you what my idea is. The idea is to play bishop to f2, attacking his rook. And after he plays his rook over attacking my bishop, to sacrifice my bishop for his g-pawn. Now, if he doesn't take my bishop, fine. I'm a head up. That shatters his kingside pawns, and, well, actually, I'm going to win that knight on h4 also. So he really doesn't have any choice about whether or not he takes my bishop. After he takes the bishop, my plan was to continue on with knight to h5 check. And this is where I'm, in for a penny, in for a dime or a dollar, whatever the saying is. Because what I was seeing was that was not that he would go back, but that he could come forward, attacking my knight, and rather than defending my knight, I would try to draw him into a mating net. And so I was analyzing the various possibilities. Now, it turns out that I was right, that this is a position where White gets mated no matter what, I think in most 6 moves. And I got most of the variations worked out. I didn't have every single variation worked out, or at least I was a little unsure about things. But back when I made that original move, bishop to f2, these were the positions I was, analyzing. And what I was thinking I would do in this position is to play f5 check. Now, of course, his king could go back, but then I would be happy to go ahead and scoop up this knight with my queen. So that's really not a great thing for him. And if the king comes forward, takes the knight, then this doesn't work out at all well for him either. right? So I can just check him with my queen. And now he's basically, all he can do is interpose his knight. And this doesn't look like a, this is not, okay, this is not the computer's mate in 6. This is just my analysis. And I guess the computer found a forced mate here. Let's see if it still has it. So my analysis, maybe I should show it to you. It was queen takes, knight check, king back, and then queen takes that bishop. But let's go back a little bit and see what the computer was thinking for its mate in 5. Ah, right, to bring the other knight in. And the combination of another piece would in fact do it. With my queen taking, it's, a crushing position for black, and I'd be very happy to play this position, but it isn't the forced mate. Anyway, he didn't come forward. He didn't come forward and accept that. No, what he did in this position, when right here, after my knight checked, he went back to h2. So that's okay. I've given my piece away. And so now we both have 3 minor pieces, but I have, it's only temporary because I'm winning his knight. So, it's, the resulting tally is I've actually gained 1 pawn more than I had previously. So I'm still a piece ahead, plus I gained an extra pawn. And I thought that this would be good, but it turns out he can mobilize his pieces pretty fast. So first he played his bishop to attack my queen. I retreated. Then he moved his other bishop to attack my knight. I retreated that. And now so I think Stockfish wanted me to just defend it with my bishop, but I was too worried if I made this move that at some point I would be asking for him to advance his pawn to f5, because that bishop would be overworked. It couldn't take the pawn on a5 and also defend the knight at the same time. Turns out it's okay, but I was reluctant to do that. So I did not do that. So instead, I dropped my knight back to f6. Okay, he put his rook on the half-open file here, staring down at my king. And now I started to get a little worried. And of course, I was behind in time as well, as I always am. And so what I did was to play bishop to f5, right? So in this position right here, bishop to f5. And the reason is that he's threatening to push this pawn forward and open up the queen's eyes. Oops, not to that square. Let's see if I can undo paint arrow. Yes. If he's would be threatening at that point to take on h6 because my g-pawn is pinned. But by putting my bishop on f5, it obstructs that pawn from moving, the f-pawn. And as long as I can keep it there, then he's not going to be able to use that way to attack my king side. And I was a little worried that, that there might be a pawn advance supported by pieces that would drive my bishop away, and then the f-pawn would advance. But, there isn't one, according to, let's see, according to Stockfish. Yeah, it's still, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to make that pawn advance immediately. There's, no way to immediately advance in the center like that. And so Stockfish says, play bishop to c3, which is what Paul did. I was actually back in this position, expecting the bishop to come here to h4, pinning my knight to my queen, and making it a little awkward, but I could step out of that by queen to e6 is what I had in mind. Instead, he came to c3, which is really stronger because now that's picking on my weak square at g7. If I move my knight, then I could get into very serious difficulty with rook takes pawn check, for example, or bishop takes pawn. So I didn't move my knight. I left it where it was, and I unpinned that pawn, and also vacated the g8 square so that I would be able to come over with my rook. Actually, I didn't do that first. I will come over with my rook, but first I took advantage of the fact that his f pawn is presently undefended. All right, and by playing queen to e3, there's not a real convenient way to defend that pawn. And I mean, he could retreat his bishop or something and have the queen defended. I thought maybe he'd do that, but that gets the bishop out of its active post. And so instead, what he did, well, I keep accidentally hitting my magic mouse here, and it's making moves when I don't want it to. Instead, he went ahead and developed his queen, threatening checkmate. That's something I have to make a response to, but I have a Zug. I can take the pawn first, check, king goes to the corner, and then I can defend that g-pawn. And now, this is the first time in a handful of moves here where I started to breathe a bit easier, because I felt that I had sufficient firepower on g7 to keep it safe. And also, if I really had to, I could bring one of my knights to e8 to also defend that square. So I was starting to feel a bit better here. Okay, he played rook to d1. I'm not totally sure why. Oh, I know why that was. That's right. He was getting ready to support bishop to d2, driving my king away, or my queen away. But I planned on moving it first anyway. So I came over to h4, double attack on his h-pawn. And there's no convenient way to avoid that other than to move his king up. And that gives me time now to feed my other knight into the game. So I'm getting my last few pieces active and into the attack. So he went ahead and was threatening to come into this f4 square. So he brought it, he could have played his bishop to d2 to control this square, but instead he chose to do it from e5. And that's reasonable because that still keeps the pressure on my knight. But I just chose to go ahead and play my knight in anyhow, putting a third attack on this pawn on h4, on h3, rather. Stockfish didn't, at this point recommended the knight going to g5 and attacking the pawn again. That way it couldn't get traded off, and he had nothing better than to make a series of exchanges. But my move's okay. So he went ahead and traded that. I check the king. It goes back to h1. It's kind of funny, actually. I go back to h4, and the king comes back out. Okay, and now my idea is to bring the other knight to this f4 square. But first, I decided to get my last piece into the game and to start to make long-term threats of their rook on e2. He dropped his queen back to presumably to lead with his rook along the g file, but that's a little slow. As I said, I'm bringing my knight in where it can actually be directly in the attack. And he played his rook to g2. This is a mistake, but it's not really a bad mistake. It's not a bad mistake because things are pretty bad anyhow. A better move was to go to g4 with his bishop and just, make some exchanges, take back with his rook. And then my queen drops back, and now, I'm putting a lot of pressure on the e-pawn. It's a very bad position for black. We're down in the -10 range, so, I probably should just skip through these moves pretty quickly. But with the rook blocking the defense of the h-pawn, I'm able to go ahead and take it. His king drops back, and now I made an inaccuracy here, and the eval dropped a couple of points. And I didn't realize I was making an inaccuracy. It looked like it was a good plan, but it doesn't. If his queen goes to f2, of course, there's a immediate checkmate. But on e1, that all of a sudden, when I was looking at this position, I realized that that I'm losing my knight if I go in for the queen check. And my knight doesn't have, I can back my knight back out through a5, through h5 immediately. Right now, I could play the knight back to h5, but sorry. Okay, we're in this position. No, we're in that position. Right now, I could in fact make this. Got to give him a move first. I could make this move, but I was a little worried that rook to h2 might end up actually winning my knight on h5. It doesn't because there's a queen check. If he did that, this is kind of maddening. Sorry. Okay, queen over, knight to h5. If he actually came over, I could check him, and trade queens off, basically. Yeah, queen takes queen, knight takes. Or if you played, if you interpose a rook, I would trade the queens. So I mean, I would have been okay, but at that point, I was really short of time and worried that I actually might be hanging a piece and losing the initiative. So at least this way, I'm getting the queens off the board. So I went ahead with only a few minutes left and went for the check, the king up, trade the queens, and now that knight is lost because there's no way for it to come out. But at least I can get a pawn for it and force a very favorable endgame. So the knight comes out, and if he wants to win it, which he does, then I'm able to take back with the bishop, and now I'm going to take that bishop off the board, a pair of bishops. So he exchanged those. It was pinned. I did not take back with the rook. Not sure why it's doing that. Oh yeah, I did. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm thinking about later in the game. I did take back with the rook here. So, as my note says, actually 2 moves ago, I stopped keeping score. So these are, the next few moves are reconstructed from my memory and may not be perfectly correct, but I think they're right. I was under 4 minutes, and so I just went ahead and made moves as quickly as I could. He played his pawn up. I doubled. He came up with his king, which is not good because then I can play d4, and that pawn is pinned. His rook on e1 is going to be attacked twice through the pawn, and he has, if he defended with his rook, I would trade off both pairs of rooks. So he didn't do that. He played rook to c2, check, and he has to take off the one pair. His king stopped the pawn. He came up. Okay, this was about as far as I reconstructed. But you can see what's happening here. Black is up by 5 pawns and 5 very healthy pawns. He can have my a pawn if he wants. I don't care. But basically what happens in the game is just even these 2 pawns with this rook down here are strong enough because I end up being able to push the f pawn, and if he ever takes with the king, then e pawn scoots. And so those pawns went forward, and I ended up actually checkmating him on e1. So it was a real time scramble at the end, but it didn't blow the lead that I had. And it basically the whole game just came down to that one mistake really, where he allowed that knight to get pinned right here with f4, and that pin on e3 was just deadly, and the knight was just too weak there, too hard to defend. So anyhow, that's it. I'm running almost to 40 minutes here. Sorry I took so long. If you're still listening, thanks for being so patient. This is Roger Capello saying, keep pushing those pawns. I'll see you next week. So long.